David Thompson, A Symphony of Resilience. The opulent Lincoln Arts Center buzzed with New York's musical elite, their muffled laughter echoing through the Grand Hall. Vincent Sterling, a renowned Chopin interpreter, spotted a young, blind black boy standing by the Steinway grand piano, his white cane clutched tightly. "Hey, kid, how about playing something for us? I bet you know Happy Birthday." Vincent's voice dripped with condescension, eliciting snickers from the audience. 16-year-old David Thompson stood motionless, the awkward silence thick around him. He had arrived with his public school music teacher, an unlikely guest at this exclusive charity recital. Vincent, in his Armani tuxedo, reveled in his self-importance, viewing David as an embodiment of misplaced diversity policies. "Come on, don't be shy," Vincent pressed. "I'm sure our generous donors would love to see how we invest in diversity." Miss Patricia Wells, the foundation's director, muttered about impropriety but didn't intervene. Vincent was a star, responsible for millions. David took a deep breath, his fingers tightening. No one knew he practiced 8 hours a day on a borrowed keyboard, or that at 3, he could reproduce entire symphonies. And no one imagined that in that moment of humiliation, he was memorizing every note, every chord, every nuance of Vincent's arrogance. Actually, David's calm voice cut to the murmurs, "I prefer Bach." Vincent genuinely laughed. "Bach, really? What piece could you play, young man?" David replied with serene confidence, "Partita No. 2 in C minor, but perhaps it's a little too advanced for this audience." A thick silence fell. There was something in David's quiet certainty that hinted at an extraordinary secret. Vincent felt a twinge of irritation. Bach's Partita in C minor was incredibly complex, known for breaking experienced pianists. Too advanced? Vincent scoffed, his voice sharpening. "Young man, you're speaking to people who finance the world's greatest orchestras." Margaret Rothschild, a banking heiress and the foundation's main patron, whispered, "How rude. Someone needs to teach this generation some manners." David remained still, but his fingers on the cane relaxed, like a surgeon before an operation. "Vincent," interjected Dr. Harrison Webb, conductor of the Boston Symphony Orchestra, "perhaps we should continue." No, Vincent cut in. "Young David here seems to question our guest's sophistication. I think it's only fair he demonstrate this musical superiority." Vincent sat at the piano, playing the first few bars of Partita with exaggerated movements. "You see, David, this piece requires not only technique, but emotional maturity, something that takes decades to develop." What Vincent didn't know was that David knew every nuance of that performance. Since losing his sight and parents in a car accident 8 years prior, music had become his solace and necessity. His Aunt Deborah, a cleaning lady at the city's music conservatory, had gotten him access to rare recordings and braille sheet music. David had memorized hundreds of pieces, studying their historical interpretations, variations, and emotional contexts. "Dr. Sterling," David said, deliberately misusing the title. "You played the first few bars in D major. Partita No. 2 is in C minor." An icy silence descended. Vincent felt blood rush to his face. He had intentionally changed the key to test David, not expecting to be corrected publicly. Obviously, it was intentional, Vincent lied, his voice losing its smoothness. "I was testing his basic musical ear." "I see," David replied calmly. "Then you must also know that Bach composed his Partita after the death of his first wife, Maria Barbara. Each movement reflects a stage of mourning. That's why playing it correctly requires more than technique. It requires having known real loss." This statement hit Vincent like a punch. His own interpretations were technically perfect, but cold. "Very good," Vincent said, his mask of superiority cracking. "Since you're so knowledgeable about music theory, how about showing us in practice?" David approached the piano, leaving his cane against the bench. His hands found the keys with the precision of someone who had mapped thousands of keyboards in his mind. "One question before I begin," David said, turning slightly to the audience. "Has anyone here ever lost everything they loved in a single moment and had to rebuild their soul note by note?" The silence that followed was different, one of recognition, not discomfort. Vincent felt a chill of apprehension. Enough cheap philosophy. Vincent snapped, his social politeness gone. Either you play now or you leave. Margaret Rothschild murmured loudly about standards. David nodded slowly, his hands still hovering. You're right about standards. They're really important. Dr. Webb frowned, sensing something others missed. David's Aunt Deborah recognized that tone. He used it before solving impossible math problems or revealing a secret project. David wasn't just talented. He was prodigious. Actually, David replied, adjusting on the bench, I'd like to make a small change. Instead of partita number 2, how about something more educational for the audience? Vincent scoffed. Educational? Kid? What exactly could you teach us? David turned to the audience, his blind eyes seeming to see through their social masks. How about demonstrating the difference between playing notes correctly and playing music? A murmur ran through the room. Very well, Vincent said, walking to the piano. Since you want to give a lesson, I'll demonstrate first how the partita should be played by someone who has actually studied music. David stepped aside, a barely perceptible smile crossing his face. He had placed his opponent exactly where he wanted him. Vincent played with his usual technical precision. Every note was in place, every beat perfectly measured. As Vincent played, David closed his eyes, memorizing every nuance, every stylistic choice. Deborah watched, a mix of pride and apprehension. Dr. Webb also noticed David's quiet focus, a calmness from absolute preparation. Vincent finished with a flourish, pleased with himself. The audience applauded politely. And now, Vincent said, grandly gesturing, let's see how you interpret this piece that is clearly beyond your capabilities. David approached the bench but paused, addressing the audience. Before I begin, I'd like you to know something about the music you just heard. The partita number 2 was not written merely as a technical exercise. Bach composed it as a dialogue with grief. Each movement represents a different phase of mourning for the loss of his wife, Maria Barbara. Some guests leaned forward. The first movement represents denial. The second is anger against God, against fate. Vincent rolled his eyes. Any first-year student knows that. David smiled. You're right. Historical context is easy to memorize, but to experience that pain personally, that changes everything. He sat down. The difference, Dr. Sterling, between your interpretation and mine is not technical. It's that you played the notes Bach wrote. I'm going to play the tears he shed. An electric expectation filled the air. Deborah clenched her fists. David was about to bare his soul. Vincent stood, his expression oscillating between irritation and growing apprehension. David took a deep breath, closing his eyes. In his mind, he was back in that hospital 8 years ago, discovering he would never see again. When his hands touched the keys, something magical happened. These weren't just notes. They were notes transformed by lived experience, by real pain, by genuine loss. The first notes made Vincent recoil. David played as if talking directly to Bach. Each phrase carried the weight of his own brutal denial, anger, and ultimately transformative acceptance. My God, whispered Dr. Webb, I have never heard performance with such emotional depth. Vincent's legs trembled. David's technique wasn't just flawless. It was superior. Margaret Rothschild had tears streaming down her face. David's music wasn't just perfect. It was transformative, touching forgotten places in her soul. Vincent watched, paralyzed, as his own interpretation was systematically dismantled. Every technically correct but emotionally empty choice he'd made for decades was exposed by David's raw genius. As David reached the third movement, representing acceptance and transcendence, it took on a spiritual dimension. David was no longer playing for the audience. He was playing through them, connecting everyone to the universal experience of loss and rebirth. Vincent, Dr. Webb whispered, this boy, he is one of the greatest natural talents I have ever witnessed. Something shattered inside Vincent. This blind black kid from the projects was better than any pianist he had ever known. The entire room was silent, save for the transcendent music. People who came to flaunt social status were confronted with genuine, undeniable power. As David approached the climax, Vincent realized the full extent of his arrogance. Every movement revealed years of intensive study, fierce discipline. an understanding of music that transcended formal education. He memorized our entire conversation, Vincent muttered, the realization hitting him like lightning. He knew exactly what David was doing. Deborah smiled through her tears. The world was finally seeing what she had always known. Vincent looked around, seeing his own destruction reflected in the elite's faces. Margaret Rothschild's expression mixed disappointment and disgust. Dr. Webb shook his head. "How dare you?" Patricia Wells whispered, her gaze fixed on Vincent. "Try to humiliate a child with such an extraordinary gift." Vincent tried to respond, but the words died in his throat. There was no explanation. He had tried to use his privilege to crush a boy who represented everything music should be. Pure, honest, transformative. David concluded the partita with a sacred delicacy. His hands lingered on the keys, sealing a pact with the music. When he stood, there was no arrogant triumph, just the quiet dignity of someone who had shared his soul. The ovation was unlike anything that room had witnessed. Simultaneous recognition, apology, and celebration. People rose as if in the presence of something divine. Vincent stood motionless, his reputation rewritten in real time. In 15 minutes, David had destroyed the image Vincent had spent decades building. "Mr. Sterling," Dr. Webb said, approaching with contempt, "I think we have a lot to talk about regarding the future of your contract." Margaret Rothschild took out her phone. Vincent knew news of his humiliation would spread instantly. David approached Vincent, extending his hand. "Thank you for the opportunity to play, Dr. Sterling. Sometimes we need to be confronted with our own music to understand who we really are." Vincent shook David's hand with trembling fingers, finally understanding he had witnessed not only an extraordinary performance, but his own social downfall. As David received congratulations, Vincent, who had tried to crush talent with privilege, discovered that music, like justice, has its own ways of balancing the scales. The aftermath, justice and triumph. 6 months later, David Thompson walked the halls of the prestigious Juilliard School of Music as a full scholarship student, the youngest in its history. Dr. Harrison Webb had personally ensured David received the best educational opportunities. His practice room overlooked Central Park, a stark contrast to the damp church basement where he learned. His teachers saw him not as charity, but as a future master. Margaret Rothschild, who had once scoffed, now personally funded his studies and established a foundation to identify overlooked musical talents in poor communities. "That boy taught me that privilege without purpose is just waste," she confessed in the New York Times. Meanwhile, Vincent Sterling faced a starkly different reality. His contracts with major orchestras were canceled one by one. The video of David's performance and Vincent's cruel attempt at humiliation had gone viral, racking up millions of views and devastating comments about prejudice. Vincent attempted a European tour, but even there, the story followed him. Critics questioned not only his technique, but his humanity. Sterling plays the right notes, but his music lacks the soul we witnessed in that young prodigy, wrote an influential critic. Patricia Wells, the foundation's director, was forced to resign due to public outcry over her enabling of prejudice. Deborah Thompson watched her nephew prepare for another solo performance at Carnegie Hall, this time as the featured artist. She thought about how the accident that took his sight also revealed a gift that might never have blossomed otherwise. "Don't you feel angry about what happened?" she asked as David tuned his new Stradivarius violin, on loan from the Rothschild Foundation. David smiled. "Andy, Vincent Sterling gave me the greatest gift of my life that night. He gave me an audience." The irony was clear. Vincent had tried to crush him, but had inadvertently created the opportunity for true musical genius to reveal itself. At Carnegie Hall, David played to a sold-out audience, including Margaret Rothschild, now a fervent advocate for music inclusion. Vincent Sterling watched the live broadcast from his empty Queens apartment. Every note David played was a reminder of his own moral and professional fall. When David finished his performance, a devastatingly beautiful rendition of the same partita that had changed everything, he stepped to the microphone. "Music doesn't belong to any of us," he said, his voice echoing. "She exists to connect human hearts regardless of our background or appearance. That is the true democracy of art." The ovation lasted 15 minutes. People cried openly, witnessing something transformative. 2 years later, David's first album became the best-selling classical music album of the decade. Vincent Sterling continued to give private lessons at a community school, his international career permanently destroyed by his own arrogance. The difference between them wasn't just success, but how they used their talent. David uses music to uplift others, establishing educational programs in underserved communities. Vincent uses to elevate himself until he discovered that heights built on prejudice always come crashing down. David Thompson's story became legendary, proving that true artistic excellence knows no color, no social class, and no limitations imposed by those who fear greatness in others. As David always told young students facing discrimination, the best revenge is not to destroy those who hurt you, but to build something greater than they could ever imagine.